Last time we talked about Absalom, how he worked the people for 4 years in hopes of becoming king. He traveled with 200 men down to Hebron, and while he was there, he declared himself as king of Israel. The Bible says that people continually came and joined him, so he's able to form quite an army. David decides to leave Jerusalem, and he has to climb the Mount of Olives. Many things happen on this short hike. At the top, he meets his good friend Hushai, who is one of his advisors. That's where we left off last time. So today we're going to look in 2 Samuel 15. We're going to start in verses 31 and 32. It says, Then someone told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, I pray, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness.
Now it happened when David had come to the top of the mountain. There's something very symbolic in there. He's part way up, he's making the climb, and he prays this prayer to God. This is one of those quick prayers that we talked about Wednesday night. Just, I have a burden on my heart, and I'm letting the Lord know about it. He prays it, and when he reached the top of the mountain, where he worshiped God, there Hushai the Archite was coming to meet him with his robe torn and dust on his head. And so we have Hushai, who the Bible talks about being his good friend. And 1 Chronicles 27, and 32 through 34, it has the leadership of David. In the 33rd verse, it says, Hushai the Archite was the king's companion. Another translation just translated friend. He was somebody that was David's counsel, but he was just a good, solid friend to David. So it wasn't political arrangement. It wasn't something of opportunity. They just liked each other, and they were really good friends. So Hushai and Ahithophel have both taken leave from Jerusalem, gone back home, taking care of business. And Hushai hears about what's happened, and he tears his clothes, and he puts ashes on his head, and he heads to where he knows David's going to be. And so he meets David on top of the mountain. And he says in 33, David said to him, If you go on with me, you will become a burden to me. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, I will be your servant, O king, as I was your father's servant previously. So I will now also be your servant. Then you may defeat the counsel of Ahithophel for me. And the more I thought about these verses, the more I just see God's hand in it. David stops when he becomes burdened with a prayer, climbs the mountain, and so it's just a few minutes later, he meets Hushai, his good friend. And Hushai is not able to go on with him, but David says, I have a job for you. I have something really important I need you to do. And that's go to Jerusalem and give your allegiance to Absalom and then work Ahithophel's counsel to foolishness. And Hushai's like, willing to do it. But that was the answer to David's prayer. He was burdened moments before, not knowing what was going to happen, and then the answer to his prayer is there. Now, Hushai had already been journeying. Hushai had already, was going to meet him on top of the mountain. But if David hadn't stopped and prayed and realized the burden he was feeling and said that prayer, what would his words be when he saw Hushai? When he saw Hushai, he knew he had the answer to his prayer. Ahithophel is a very wise man, very cunning, and could give Absalom really good counsel. But David needed somebody to stand in the middle, to be his champion, to be the man in the middle, to turn that counsel into foolishness. And Hushai was there. And Hushai was able and willing and had enough prestige in Jerusalem that Absalom would listen to him. And we're going to find that right away, as Absalom prepares for battle against David, Ahithophel gives him solid advice, and Hushai intervenes and causes Absalom to do the wrong thing, military-wise. He intervenes. He turns that counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Hushai was as responsible for the defeat of Absalom as David's army, because he got Absalom to and lead his army foolishly. This is the answer to the prayer, and it's just so quick that David receives it. Sometimes I know we feel like we have to wait a long time for God's answer to come, and other times it's almost immediate and it stares us right in the face. But we have to be mindful of what is going on and just recognize that the answer is there. And sometimes the answer is relying on other people, which is not always easy to do. But that's what David needed. He needed a group of people that were going to be loyal to him. So he tells them to, go to Jerusalem, become Absalom's advisor, and then work for me doing that. And it says in 35, and do you not have Zadok and Abiathar, the priest, both high priest, with you there? Therefore it will be whatever you hear from the king's house, you will tell to Zadok and Abiathar, the priest. Indeed, they have there with them their two sons, Ahimaaz, Zadok's son, and Jonathan, Abiathar's son. And by them you shall send me everything you hear. So Hushai, David's friend, went into the city, and Absalom came into Jerusalem. So here we have the end of the chapter. So David has this group of men working for him, all very important, influential men. Both high priests are loyal to David. They marched out of Jerusalem with David with the Ark of the Covenant. They were wanting to set up a new city and build a new temple or tabernacle. But David told them to go back. We talked about that more last week, but how he wanted the tabernacle and the sacrifices to continue. But they were there as David's servants, doing the things of God, but working to restore David to become king, because they were his friends. And the same thing with Hushai. And so he has his and also their sons. So we have these 5 men, all leaders in their own areas, who are going to be working towards having David return and keeping things moving for David. And as we go through this, we see Christ everywhere. And our pastor encourages us to do that. But with David, it's really, really easy. So we have a parable, or like many of Christ's parables. The master of the city, the king of the city, goes off into a far country. And he leaves his servants there to work for him. And that's what's happening here. David, the king, is going off into the wilderness on a journey. No one knows when he's going to come back. It could be years. It could be a decade. Whenever God works it out, he's going to return. And these 5 men are going to work preparing things for the king to come back, doing things to enable the king to come back, working for the Lord. They're left with those duties. So we have a parable here, or the beginning of a parable here, which Christ starts. One of the things I admire about David was his ability to turn things over to God. When this is happening, he just gives it to God. He's not sure what step to take. He leaves the city because if there's going to be a war, he doesn't want it happening in Jerusalem. But he wants to take time for God to work things out. Maybe God will work on Absalom's heart. And one of the things that we love about David is he's always wanting to seek reconciliation. And I think in the time that he left and go in the wilderness, I'm sure his prayer at night was that God would work on Absalom's heart and bring him home. Bring him back to God. Bring him back into the fold. David didn't want his son to die. Even though all this was happening, he wanted his son to live, to give him a chance to be reconciled to David, but also to God. And he never, Ahithophel, the same thing. His prayer was that his counsel be turned to foolishness, not that he die, not that he suffer, not that God destroys him. Again, a chance for reconciliation. And in the 25th verse, I'm going to refer to this quite a bit. But it says, if I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back and show me both it and his dwelling place. And so there was this hope as David leaves that God will bring him back, that God will find favor in him and bring him back. So he goes on this journey looking forward to the promises of God, the assurance of God. He's life is complicated, isn't it? He's got the sin he committed with Bathsheba, the sword not departing from his house, his own sins. Is this God's judgment? But he's repented, it's been forgiven, he's going away, and he puts his life in God's hands. Whatever God's will is, that's what I want to happen. So he puts his life in God's hands, he goes on this journey, and he says, if God finds favor, he's going to return me. And as we go through life, it gets complicated. We're going to have mixed emotions, we're going to have mixed feelings. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or next week or next year. But we give it to God, and we allow Him to take control of it. And with our lives, we are on this journey down this narrow path where there's few people that understand why we're walking on this path. The crowds go down the wide path, the broad path. But we choose to go down this narrow path. That's steep, full of switchbacks. Uphills, it seems like a lot of uphills. And then when your knees get sore, then you start downhills, which make your knees even sorer. But it leads to something great. It leads us to what we're looking for. And that's what David's going on this journey, looking for the goodness of God and His just judgment, so that he might be returned. So we have David leaving. He's on top of Mount of Olives, and he's going to begin his descent. 16, we're going to see that David is going through his journey into the wilderness down this road. He's going to suffer great humiliation by a man named Shimei. And we'll go through that. And then also we'll see how Hushai's counsel changes Absalom's decision. That's what this chapter is really about. So we're going to start off with somebody else named Ziba. Now Ziba was one of Saul's servants. He was, I think, in charge of Saul's household, may have ran some of Saul's estates, vineyards, the farms, took care of the donkeys, kind of was the overseer of Saul's household and his estate. And at one point, David sent out the words, wondering, is there anyone left of Saul's household? And he was told that Jonathan, his good friend, had a son that was still alive named Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth, if you remember the story, he fell when he was young, broke his legs. They were running out of the city, and so they were never set, they were never healed, and so he became disabled. He was unable to walk, had to be cared for. And so when David finds out about that, he sends for him, he blesses him, and he tells Ziba, who seems to be very loyal to David, but also to Saul's family. He's like that perfect transition blend of what we want in somebody. And that's the way he appears. And so David appoints him to take care of Mephibosheth and to take care of Saul's estate. And so all the crops that would come in, he would sell them, and he would take the money, and he would take care of Mephibosheth. He would run the estate. He'd be like a trustee running the estate for Mephibosheth. And so as time went by, he continued to do that. But Ziba was a very crafty person, a very deceitful person. And he was always trying to figure out, how can I work an angle? And he did that by getting appointed trustee over Saul's estate, blessed him. I think he did care about Saul and Mephibosheth, but there was an angle that he worked to get that position. And now the king of Israel is leaving Jerusalem in haste. In the eyes of everybody around, he becomes weaker. David has humbled himself willingly to leave the city and go off with this army, but he's still leaving the city. And the people around the area know that Absalom's coming, and there may be a change. Ziba, being the opportunist, meets David with these items. He brings saddled donkeys to make the journey easier for David's family, 200 loaves of bread, 100 clusters of raisins, 100 summer fruits, and some wine. He gives these gifts to David. So let's go ahead and read before I talk too much. 16th chapter, first verse says, When David was a little past the top of the mountain, where there was Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, who met him with a couple saddle donkeys, and on them 200 loaves of bread, 100 clusters of raisins, and 100 summer fruits, and a skin of wine. And the king said to Ziba, "What do you mean to do with these?" And Ziba said, "The donkeys are for the king's household to ride on. The bread and summer fruit are for the young men to eat, and the wine for those who are faint in the wilderness to drink." And so Ziba comes out and gives these gifts. He sees an opportunity. And so he brings these presents to David. David is in a place where he has to figure out who's his friend and who's his foe. Who's going to be on his side? Who's going to be on the side of Absalom? The country was divided because Absalom had worked the people for 4 years. David was still a hero, but sometimes people don't like old heroes. They want somebody new, somebody young. And so David's trying to figure out, who can I rely on as he's leaving the city? Is Ziba somebody I can rely on? Can I use him the way that Hushai and Zadok and Abithar are being used? He's trying to figure this out. So Ziba is an opportunist, and he's there for his own benefit. He's not there to help David. He's seeing what he can get from David. And so he gives him all these presents. And then in the third verse, it says, Then the king said, "Where is your master's son?" And Ziba said to the king, "Indeed, he is staying in Jerusalem. For he said, 'Today the house of Israel will restore the kingdom for my father to me.'" So Ziba gives David these gifts and then lies about Mephibosheth. We know he's lying because when David comes back, Mephibosheth is one of the people he's insisting that he's taken out to greet David and rejoices that David's coming back. But so Ziba's lying. He wants to take advantage of David's confusion. I mean, how many things are going through David's mind at this point? Unknown about the future and all these people, the city, what God's going to do. And Ziba comes out and he tells him that Mephibosheth is trying to be restored as the king. That he's saying that this is what God's doing. He's going to make me king again. And so Ziba's hoping that David will give him everything that belongs to Saul's household, everything that belongs to Mephibosheth. And so it says in the next verse, it's verse 4, "So the king said to Ziba, 'Here, all that belongs to Mephibosheth is yours.' And Ziba said, 'I humbly bow before you, so I may find favor in your sight, O my lord, O king.'" And so David does what Ziba wants. He gives him everything that he desires. He gets the household and the estate of Saul. He takes advantage of this king. And there's, in the political sense, there's a power vacuum because there's two people with the right, claiming the right to the throne. Count Mephibosheth, which really doesn't have much of a claim. There would be three. But who's going to really ultimately be in charge? So Ziba is taking advantage of this. He's going against David in his time of weakness. So I guess my point is that the vultures are starting to circle. People are going to start picking at David, humiliating him, taking advantage of him as quickly as they can in this weakened state. And that's what we see Ziba doing. So we'll go on to verse 5. And this is when David begins to suffer humiliation and endures it. And it reminds me of Christ going before the Sanhedrin Council and the abuse he took. It was physically and emotionally. And, just like he was humiliated. He was beaten. They mocked him. And then they took him to the Romans, where the Roman soldiers stripped him, put the crown of thorns on him, gave him the reed, a purple robe on, to humiliate him like he's some great king. And he walked to Golgotha, and we'll get into more. I don't want to get too far into it. But when it happened to Christ, the sins of the world have been put upon him, I think, in the Garden of Gethsemane. And Christ was bearing those sins. And so he went to the cross silent as a lamb to the slaughter. He endured those things. David is bearing his own sins. He's bearing the sins of his son. He doesn't know what's going to be restored, other than the fact he knows God's goodness and God's righteousness and God's forgiveness and grace and mercy. And that's what he's relying on, that he might be restored. But in the meantime, he knows this journey he's going to go through is going to be full of humiliations. And people today still talk bad about David for fleeing the city. His reputation is still suffering because he didn't grab an army and march down to meet Absalom halfway. People talk about, oh, he's so weak, he's so dumb, he doesn't want to fight. David is full of wisdom and grace. He's like the Lord. He wants reconciliation. The Bible says that God has no pleasure in the sin or death of the wicked. What pleasure would it be to have his son killed? What pleasure would there be in his counselors being killed? As opposed to having them all reconcile, beg for forgiveness, and come back to him and want to be in his good graces. David is much like the Lord. Man after God's own heart. And that's, so even today, people talk bad about David, and I think they're not realizing the big picture of how close David was in the mind to God and the heart of God. So we have a member of Saul's household in the next few chapters. His name is Shimei. I looked that one up because I wasn't sure how to pronounce it. Shimei. He's from the town of Barum, which is about a mile and a half or so from Jerusalem. Nobody knows exactly where it is. Somewhere on the downward slope on the other side of Mount Olives, or somewhere in the wilderness that's just beyond. So that's where it is. Some people think it's Nob, the city of Nob, which has come up in the Old Testament quite a bit during this time. But anyway, that's where he's from. And he's a member of Saul's household. And again, this is a vulture that's starting to circle. He's going to start humiliating and going after David and cursing him. And it says, in the 5th verse, now when King David came to Barum, there was a man from the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera, coming from there. He came out, cursing continuously as he came. And as he threw stones at David, and at all the servants of the king of David, and all the people, and all the mighty men were on his right hand and on his left. So this is a very brave man. I think the Bible doesn't say he's crazy, but he's certainly full of himself, full of pride. And he's coming out there cursing at David, throwing stones, and not only hitting David, but hitting Joab and hitting Abishai, hitting his other servants that are riding with him, picking up the dirt as they're passing by, cursing at him, and he's like a madman. He just keeps going at it, saying that this is God's punishment for what you did to Saul. And it's like, well, there's somebody with a bent sense of the truth. David didn't kill Saul. Saul died on his own sword. He was mortally wounded by the Philistines. And David had nothing to do with it. That was way up north, and David was down south. He had nothing to do with it. But yet, this man is blaming David for what happened to Saul and for Saul's death. And he says that God's now avenging the death of Saul upon David. So this constant continue of cursing and of rock throwing and all this. He's being treated terribly by this man. Humiliating. Here he is, the king, and all of his servants, down to the basic foot soldier. And David's taking this abuse. They're hearing all these things happening. And I'm sure every one of them had their sword ready or their spear ready to do something about it. But David's going to tell them, no, don't do anything. He's going to endure the punishment. He's going to endure this because he says that God has told him to do this. That God has told Shimei to do this humiliation. So he goes forward silently, taking it. This is such a picture of the endurance of Christ and what he had to endure From the time he was arrested until he gave up, until he said it was finished. He went through the humiliation in front of his own people. They rejected him. When he went to Pilate, he was beaten. Pilate wanted to let him go. And his own people said, no, crucify him, crucify him. And they kept yelling it. Crucify him. He is not our king. Caesar is our only king. They rejected Christ. And so Christ endures because the sin has been put upon him. He has to go through this time of suffering. And as I said, silent as a lamb going to the slaughter. He knew, David doesn't know what's going to happen, but Christ knew what was going to happen. David had an army that with a blink could have killed Shimei, but he didn't call on it. Christ had 10,000 angels he could have called on and destroyed the whole Roman army and those Jews and everybody else, but he didn't call upon them. He endured. And so next week we're going to talk more about this.